The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and gray and swollen with malice. For 2 days, the wind had screamed across the Wyoming plains, a high, thin sound that Helen McCrae felt in her teeth. It was not a storm. It was a war. She huddled on the packed dirt floor of the small cabin, her arms wrapped around her knees, listening to the shrieks of the wind and the relentless, driving assault of the rain. The cabin, built of cottonwood timbers that her late husband, David, had hauled 5 miles from the creek, had been their bastion. Now, it was failing. Water was no longer just seeping under the door. It was bubbling up through the floor, turning the earth to a cold, thick slurry. The roof, patched with sod, was dissolving. A steady drip near the hearth had become a dozen streams, a steady drumming that matched the panic in her heart. David had been gone 6 months, taken by a winter fever that had burned through him in less than a week. Helen had borne that grief. She had buried him on the small rise behind the cabin, shouldered his rifle, and learned to set snares. She had survived the winter alone. She had intended to survive the spring, but the land was not done with her. The sound, when it came, was not a crack of thunder. It was a low, wet groan, the sound of earth giving way. The creek, which ran a 1/4 mile distant, had breached its banks. She knew it before she saw it. A dark wave, not tall but impossibly heavy, struck the north wall of the cabin. The impact threw her against the cold stones of the hearth. Timbers splintered. The sound of the wind was replaced by the roar of water. The cabin, her home, the last physical piece of David left in the world, did not just flood. It was erased. The walls collapsed inward, and the roof, heavy with water, disintegrated. She was in the water, the current pulling at her skirts, mud and debris striking her. She grabbed onto the one thing that still stood, the stone chimney, and clung to it as the world dissolved around her. The rain fell like needles, cold and sharp, and the water rose to her waist. She stayed there for hours, long after the main rush had passed, shivering until the gray light of dawn revealed the totality of her ruin. There was nothing left. The cabin was a pile of splintered wood and black mud. The small paddock was gone. Her meager vegetable garden was a swamp. The plains, which had seemed so full of promise, were now just an endless, flat expanse of gray water under a gray sky. She did not weep. Tears were a luxury, like dry boots or a hot meal. Weeping required energy she did not have. There was only the cold and a hollow numbness that felt worse than the grief she had known before. This was not loss. This was annihilation. It took her most of the morning to find Bess, her old mule, who had been smart enough to break her tether and get to the high ground by the burial mound. The mule stood hip-shot, shivering, one leg favoring the other, her coat plastered with mud. Helen whispered to her, her voice a dry rasp, and ran a shaking hand down the animal's neck. She salvaged what she could, which was almost nothing. She waded back into the wreckage, the mud sucking at her boots, pulling at the hem of her wool dress. She found her mother's Bible, the leather cover swollen and the pages fused into a solid block of wet paper. She found the small, tin-framed photograph of herself and David, taken the day they had driven the stake for the cabin. The glass was shattered, the image within a pale watercolor blur, their faces washed away. She took the small tin of tea leaves she had kept by the hearth, and from the mud, her fingers closing around the cold, familiar circle, she pulled her wedding ring. It had slipped from her numb finger during the night. She slid it back on, the mud gritty beneath the band. She wrapped these 3 things, the Bible, the broken photograph, the tea, in a piece of oilcloth and tied the bundle, along with a damp blanket, to Bess's saddle. She did not look back at the ruin, or at the simple wooden cross on the hill. Looking back was a way to die standing up. She tied a rope to Bess's halter and began to walk east, toward the settlement. It was more than 15 miles. The journey was a slow torment. The ground was saturated, a vast mire that pulled at her boots with every step. The wind had not died. It had merely settled into a steady, relentless razor that sliced through her wet clothes and laid a chill deep in her bones. The sky remained a solid sheet of iron. Bess, with her lame leg, struggled, and Helen struggled with her. They were a pitiful sight, a half-lame mule and a half-drowned woman, tethered together, moving like ghosts through a landscape that wanted them gone. Twice, she sought help. The first ranch was the Parker homestead, 5 miles south of her own claim. She had traded with Mrs. Parker before, eggs for flour. She knocked on the solid wood door, mud dripping from her dress onto the clean porch. Mrs. Parker opened it, her face, usually kind, tightening into a mask of polite refusal. She saw Helen State, the desperate mule behind her. "Helen," she said, her voice flat. "A terrible storm. Mrs. Parker, my place is gone, washed away. I need work, anything, or just shelter, until the wind stops." The woman's eyes darted back into the warmth of her home, where Helen could smell bacon frying. "We have our own troubles. Helen, the north pasture is flooded. We've lost stock. We just cannot—" She did not say will not. She said cannot, as if it were a law of nature. Helen nodded, the pride stiffening her spine. "I understand." She did not ask again. She just turned and walked away. The second place was the 2-bar ranch, a larger, rougher outfit run by men without families. She found the foreman in the barn, mending a bridle. He was a thick-bodied man with eyes the color of dirty ice. "Looking for work," Helen said, forcing her voice to be strong. He stopped his work and looked her up and down, a slow, appraising gaze that made her skin crawl. He took in her mud-caked dress, her chapped hands, her exhaustion. "We ain't hiring," he said, his mouth twisting. "And we don't feed strays." He turned back to his bridle. The dismissal was so complete, it was as if she had ceased to exist. She saw the judgment in his eyes, and in Mrs. Parker's. A woman alone in this territory was a problem. She was a burden to the righteous and a temptation to the wicked. There was no middle ground for her, no place for a woman who was simply trying to survive. She reached the settlement just as the cold, weak light of the afternoon began to fail. It was hardly a town, just a crossing, Miller's Mercantile and Trading Post, which also served as the saloon, a blacksmith's forge, and a land office. Her wagon was still there, parked beside the blacksmith's, where she had left it weeks ago with a broken axle. It was a battered, prairie schooner type, its canvas cover torn and flapping in the wind. It was her only other possession. She tied Bess to the wagon wheel and stiffly, painfully, climbed onto the boardwalk of the Mercantile. She pushed the door open. The wave of heat that hit her was almost sickening. It smelled of wet wool, stale beer, pipe tobacco, and unwashed men. The Mercantile was long and narrow. Shelves of tinned goods and bolts of cloth on one side. A rough-hewn bar and 3 tables on the other. It was full. Drovers, ranchers, and a few sullen prospectors, all driven indoors by the storm. Every man in the room stopped talking and turned to look at her. The silence was heavy, broken only by the howl of the wind outside. Helen stood just inside the door, dripping onto the floorboards, her hands clenched at her sides. She could feel their eyes on her, a physical weight. They were not just looking, they were leering. They saw her wet clothes, which clung to her body, and the exhaustion that made her tremble. Then the whispers started, loud enough to be heard. "That's McCrae's widow. God almighty, look at her, looks half drowned. Heard her place was built too low. Foolishness." A rough-looking man at the bar, nursing a whiskey, spoke louder. "Heard McCrae didn't leave her nothing but debts. Owed money clean to Cheyenne. They say—" "Gambling debts," another added, spitting tobacco juice toward the cuspidor. "Left her holding an empty sack." Helen ignored them. She walked past the tables, her boots making wet, sucking sounds on the boards, and went to the counter at the back where Mr. Miller, the proprietor, was weighing out coffee beans. He was a thin man, with a thin mustache and eyes that never quite met yours. He looked at her, then quickly looked down at his scales. "Mr. Miller," Helen said. Her voice was shaking, not from fear, but from the cold and the humiliation. "Mrs. McCrae, bad weather. My homestead is gone. Mr. Miller, everything. I need supplies. Just flour, coffee, and some salt, And I need credit, or work. I can sweep. I can mend. I can keep your books. I write a fair hand. Mister. Miller stopped fiddling with the scales. He wiped his hands on his apron, his gaze shifting to the men at the bar, who were all watching. Now, Helen, he said, his voice pitched low, full of a false, oily sympathy. Credit is tight. And as you know, David, he left things complicated. Very complicated. There's the matter of his outstanding bill here. For one, he was telling her no, in front of all of them. He was telling her that her late husband's supposed failures were now her own. I ain't got help to hire, he added, a finality in his tone. For a moment, Helen thought she might fall. The warmth of the room, combined with the shame, made the world tilt. The faces of the men blurred. She gripped the edge of the counter. She would not beg. She had asked for work and for credit. She would not ask for charity. She was too proud to beg twice. She straightened her spine, pulling the last of her dignity around her like a shroud. I see. Thank you for your time, Mr. Miller. She turned. The men watched her, their expressions a mix of pity and crude interest. She walked the long length of the room, her head high, and pushed the door open, stepping back out into the freezing wind, which felt cleaner than the air inside. She did not see the man who had been standing in the shadows by the stove, nursing a single cup of coffee for the past hour. Silas Boone had watched the entire exchange. He had seen her walk in, a woman pushed to the very edge of her endurance. He had heard the whispers about her husband's debts, and he had seen the way her back went ramrod straight when Miller turned her away. He was a man who knew about survival. He was big, rough-edged, and quiet. A man who owned half the valley but lived more like a hired hand. The left side of his face and neck were scarred, a puckered, shiny map of old pain from a fire years ago. It gave his expression a permanent, fierce intensity. The locals called him the Millionaire Cowboy behind his back, a name born of his mysterious wealth and his steadfast refusal to socialize or remarry. He knew her, not well. He knew she was David McCrae's wife, that they had taken the small claim by the creek. He had seen her once or twice in town, a woman with quiet eyes and a strength in her jaw. He watched her leave the mercantile, her pride a thin, brittle thing that he recognized. He knew that look. It was the look of someone who had lost everything but themselves, and they would die before they lost that, too. He waited a moment, then set his empty cup on the counter, throwing a coin down beside it. He ignored Mr. Miller and the watching men, pulled his hat low, and walked out into the gathering dark. Night fell not as a blanket, but as a hammer. The temperature plummeted. The wind had teeth now, sharp and vicious, and it whipped Helen's wet hair across her face, stinging her skin. She had nowhere to go. The settlement had turned its back. She went to the wagon. It was pathetic shelter. The canvas cover was rotten, flapping in great noisy tears that let the wind and the spitting rain straight through. But it was a wall, of a sort. She untied Bess from the wheel and led the mule to the leeward side of the blacksmith's shop, hoping the small overhang of the roof would offer some protection. The animal pressed against the wall, dropping its head. Helen climbed into the wagon bed. She had the one damp blanket she had salvaged. She crawled under the rotten canvas tarp, pulling the blanket over her. It was useless. The cold soaked through instantly. She lay on the hard, wet planks, shivering so violently her teeth rattled. This, she thought, was the end. The grief for David, the loss of her home, the humiliation at the store, it all drained away, replaced by the simple, brutal, animal reality of the cold. She was freezing to death, 5 yards from a warm saloon. She curled into a tight ball, trying to conserve what little warmth she had left. She began to drift, her shivers lessening, a dangerous numbness creeping into her hands and feet. The world was reduced to the howl of the wind and the ache in her bones. She did not hear the footsteps over the storm, not until they stopped right beside the wagon. A large shape blocked the last of the gray light. A man. Her first thought was of the men from the saloon. A spike of fear, cold and sharp, cut through the numbness. "Ma'am?" The voice was not drunken. It was low, a deep rumble, and it held no threat. It just held authority. She tried to sit up, tangled in the blanket and the tarp. "Who is it?" "Silas Boone." She knew the name, the rich recluse, the man with the scars. "What do you want?" she whispered. "You'll die out here," he stated. It was not a question or an opinion. It was a fact. He gestured up the dark ridge behind the mercantile. "I've got a barn up there. It's dry, empty, just hay, but it's dry." Helen's pride, even now, rose up. He was offering charity, the one thing she could not accept. I am fine," she managed to say, her teeth chattering so hard the words were barely coherent. "Thank you, Mr. Boone, but I can manage." She tried to push herself up, to show him she was not defeated. She put a hand down on the wet plank, but her arm had no strength. The world, which had been gray and cold, suddenly went black at the edges. The effort was too much. The days without food, the shock, the unending cold. Her body had finally given up. She did not faint. She collapsed. A simple, boneless folding, her body sagging against the side of the wagon. Silas Boone swore, a single, sharp word cutting through the wind. He did not ask again. He reached into the wagon, his movements economical and sure. Helen felt his hands, large and rough, one covered by a leather glove, the other bare and scarred. They slid under her, one beneath her knees, the other behind her back. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. The shock of it was overwhelming. The sudden movement, the strength of him, the heat that radiated from his body even through his thick wool coat. She was frozen, and he was warm. She was aware, but trapped inside a body that would not obey. She could only press her face against the rough texture of his coat, smelling leather and wood smoke and the clean scent of the cold air on him. "I can walk," she mumbled, but it was a lie, and he paid it no mind. He carried her. He did not take her to his house, the large, dark shape on the hill. He took her, as promised, to the barn. It was massive, a dark cathedral against the skyline. He pushed the heavy door open with his shoulder, and they were inside. The difference was immediate. The wind was gone, its roar muffled to a distant moan. The air inside was still, cold, but absolutely dry. It smelled of old hay and dust and animals long gone. He walked across the wide, packed earth floor to a clean corner, where piles of loose, sweet-smelling hay were stacked high. He gently, carefully, set her down on the hay, which rustled beneath her. For a moment, she just lay there, breathing in the scent of safety. He stood over her, a massive silhouette against the sliver of gray light from the open door. She expected him to speak, to demand gratitude, to explain. He did nothing. He turned and left the barn, leaving the door cracked open. She heard him moving outside, the sound of his boots, the soft nicker of her mule. Bess. He was leading the animal inside, into one of the empty stalls. He returned to her. He set a lantern on the floor a few feet away, its low, golden light pushing back the shadows. Beside it, he placed a tin canteen and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Helen watched him, her eyes heavy. He crouched for a moment, his scarred face illuminated by the lantern. He looked at her, his gaze intense, assessing, but holding no pity. He just looked, as if committing her to memory. Then, without a single word, he stood, turned, and walked out of the barn. Helen listened as the heavy door slid shut, the solid thud of the latch falling into place. The silence was absolute. The wind was outside. She was inside. She lay in the hay, the exhaustion a heavy, leaden weight. She heard Bess shift in the stall. She looked at the bundle, slowly, her hands shaking. She untied the cloth. Inside was a thick slice of bread, a piece of hard cheese, and dried apple slices. She picked up the bread and began to eat. Slow, painful bites. And then, for the first time since the storm had begun, safe in the dry, anonymous darkness of a stranger's barn, Helen McCrae finally wept. Helen woke to a warmth that felt like a betrayal. She was not on the cold, wet planks of her wagon. She was cocooned in a nest of hay, thick and sweet-smelling. 2 heavy wool blankets covered her, and the lingering scent of wood smoke clung to them. Her body ached, a deep, bruised soreness from the cold and the collapse. But the shivering had stopped. She sat up slowly, her head swimming. The barn was vast and still, the only light coming from high, narrow windows thick with dust and cobwebs. The storm's roar had faded to a distant, weary moan. Beside her, on a rough wooden crate, sat a covered tin pot. She lifted the lid. Stew. It was still warm, thick with beef and potatoes. A tin cup and a spoon lay beside it. Her first instinct was a hot flare of pride. This was Charity. She was a beggar, taking food in a barn, no better than the stray's mister. Miller had turned away. She should leave. She should stand up, walk out that door, and face the world, even if it meant dying in the mud. She pushed the blankets off and stood. Her legs trembled, weak and unsteady. She made her way to the massive barn door and pushed it open just enough to look out. The world was a ruin of gray mud and torn skies. The settlement below was a cluster of wet, dark roofs. There was no one on the street. There was no warmth there. She thought of Mrs. Parker's closed door, of the leering men in the saloon. She thought of her homestead. Now just a pile of wet timber and silt. There was nowhere to go. She closed the door, the heavy thud sealing her in. The smell of the stew pulled at her. Her stomach cramped, a painful, hollow ache. Survival, she realized, had little room for pride. Pride was a luxury for those with full bellies and dry roofs. She sat on the hay and pulled the crate closer. She ate slowly at first. Then, with a desperate, trembling hunger. The stew was rich, the meat tender. It was the kindest thing that had happened to her in 6 months. With every spoonful, the warmth spread through her, pushing back the deep, bone-chilling cold. It felt like life itself. When she was finished, she found Bess in a clean stall, munching on a pile of fresh hay, a bucket of clean water at her feet. Even her mule had been tended to. This silent, scarred man had thought of everything. She felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost choked her, and it was followed immediately by the sharp sting of shame. She was indebted. She spent the morning exploring her new prison, or sanctuary. She wasn't sure which. It was an old barn, clearly not used for stock anymore, but it was solid. The timbers were massive, the roof high and vaulted, the hayloft above her head vast and shadowed. She found a broom with a broken handle and began to sweep, needing to do something, anything, to feel less like a kept animal. The great door slid open late that morning, the daylight harsh. Silas Boone entered. He carried a bundle of fresh shingles under one arm and a hammer in his hand. He did not look at her right away. He seemed to take in the barn, the swept floor, the neatly folded blankets on the hay. Helen stood, wiping her dusty hands on her skirt. "Mr. Boone," he gave a short, curt nod. "Ma'am." "The food," she said, her voice sounding thin in the huge space. "The blankets. Thank you. Thank you." He nodded again, his gaze moving past her, up to the roof. "Got a leak over the north stall. Needs mending before the next rain." He walked to a ladder built against the wall and began to climb. He did not ask her to move. He did not offer conversation. He just went to work. The sound of his hammer striking the roof boards began to echo through the barn. Thud, thud, thud. Helen stood there, feeling small and useless. She was an intruder in his space. He had saved her life. And now he was working around her. She looked around, desperate for a task. In a dark corner sat a pile of old, stiff tack, bridles cracked, leather gray with mildew, harness straps stiff as wood. She found a bucket, filled it from the water trough Bess had used, and located a stiff brush. She picked up a bridle and began to scrub. For 3 hours, they worked. The only sounds were the steady, rhythmic report of his hammer from the roof and the scrape and splash of her brush against the leather. It was a strange, shared silence. He was not a man who seemed comfortable with small talk, and she was a woman who had nothing left to say. The work was the only language they had. When he finally climbed down, his face was streaked with sweat and grime. He ran a gloved hand through his dark hair. He looked at the roof, satisfied. Then he looked at her. She had dismantled, cleaned, and begun to oil 3 bridles. Her hands were raw, her arms sore, but she felt better. "That should hold," he said, gesturing upward with the hammer. He started for the door. Panic seized her. She could not be a simple object of his charity. She had to have terms. "Mr. Boone, wait!" she called out. He stopped, his hand on the door, his back to her. "I cannot pay you for the shelter, or the food. I have nothing." Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. "But I can work. I am strong. I will work for my keep. I can mend. I can clean. I can cook. Whatever you need, I will not be a burden." He stood motionless for a long time, so long that she thought he hadn't heard her, or worse, that he was going to refuse. The silence stretched, heavy and cold. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the wood of the barn. "The stalls need mucking, and there's a section of fence down by the creek paddock." He slid the door open and was gone. Helen let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She had a purpose. She was not a beggar. She was, in a way, employed. The next days fell into a pattern. She would wake before dawn, in the cold, still dark. She would find he had already been there. A tin of coffee, a small sack of oats, sometimes a loaf of bread, would be on the crate. He never delivered them to her directly. He came like a ghost, leaving sustenance and vanishing before she woke. She worked. She mucked the stalls, hauling the heavy barrows of soiled straw to the manure pile. The physical labor was a blessing. It exhausted her body and quieted her mind. She could not grieve when she was focused on keeping her footing in the mud. He came in the afternoons. They worked on the broken fence together. He dug the post holes, his shoulders straining against the heavy, wet earth. She hauled the new cedar posts, positioning them, holding them steady while he packed the dirt. Their conversation was limited to the task at hand. "Hold it steady. The wire stretcher. That one's split. Get another." But the silence around these words grew. It was no longer the empty, awkward silence of strangers. It was a shared, comfortable quiet. She learned the rhythm of his movements. He was economical, never a wasted motion. He worked with a fierce, quiet intensity. He was a man who knew how to build, how to mend. One afternoon, he came not with tools, but with a small, shivering creature in his arms. It was a newborn calf, slick and weak, its head lolling. "Runt," he said, his voice clipped. He laid it on a bed of fresh straw in the stall next to Bess. "Damn rejected it. Won't make it through the night, but it's warmer in here than outside." He left a bucket of fresh, warm milk. Helen looked at the calf. It was pathetic, its ribs showing, its breathing shallow. It let out a bleat so thin it was barely a sound. "Well, you're not dying today," Helen whispered to it, a sudden, fierce protectiveness rising in her. "Not if I have anything to say about it?" She spent the entire night with the animal. She rubbed it dry with straw until its coat was fluffy. She forced its mouth open, dipping her fingers in the warm milk and pushing them past its gums, teaching it to suckle. It was a long, frustrating battle. The calf was weak and stubborn, and Helen was exhausted. But she would not give up. She had failed to save her husband. She had failed to save her home. She would not fail this tiny, useless creature. She fell asleep sitting against the stall wall, her hand resting on the calf's back, its breathing finally deep and steady. When she woke, light was streaming through the high windows. Silas Boone was standing not 10 feet away. Watching her, he was holding a fresh bucket of milk. Helen scrambled to her feet, embarrassed. It's alive. I think he'll make it." Silas looked at the calf, which was attempting to stand on wobbly legs. He looked at Helen, her hair full of straw, her face smudged with dirt. He didn't smile. She wasn't sure he knew how, but the tightness around his eyes softened. He set the bucket down. "Seems you have a way with lost causes, Mrs. McCrae." He turned and left. Helen, for the first time in a very long time, felt a small, strange warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the stew. The barn became her world. It was more than shelter. It was a sanctuary. It was the only place she felt safe. The house on the hill, Silas's house, was a dark shape she never approached. This barn was hers. She found a length of old rope and a heavy piece of canvas tarp. She hung it from a beam, creating a small, private corner for herself. Behind this wall, she had her bed of hay, her blankets, and the crate. It was a room of her own. She began to reclaim herself, piece by small piece. She washed her clothes in the horse trough, using the bar of lye soap he had left. She brushed her hair until it shone, tying it back with a piece of string. She needed to do something besides labor. Her mind, no longer numb with shock, was starting to ache. She found a piece of charcoal in the ashes of a long-dead fire pit outside, on a smooth, pale plank of the barn wall. Inside her canvas room, she began to draw. She drew the calf, which she'd named Stubbs, asleep in the hay. She drew her own hand, mapping the new calluses. She drew the view from the hayloft door, the endless rolling plains and the sharp, distant line of the mountains. The simple act of creation, of making a mark on a clean surface, was a relief. It was a way to pour out the grief and the fear without having to speak it. Silas saw the changes. He saw the canvas sheet and never once made a move to look behind it. He saw her mended clothes, the way she kept her small space meticulously clean. She caught him, once or twice, looking at her drawings when he thought she wasn't watching. He never said a word about them. His offerings continued, always practical: a small, three-legged iron pot, a bag of coffee beans, a whetstone. He was giving her the tools to be self-sufficient, not the comforts of a guest. He was respecting her pride. Their shared silence deepened. It was no longer about work. One evening, he came in to check on the calf. Helen was sitting on a hay bale, mending one of his old work shirts she had found, the needle flashing in the lantern light. He didn't just check the calf and leave. He leaned against the opposite stall, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He just watched her. The air in the barn was warm, filled with the scent of hay and animals. The wind was high outside, a low whistle around the eaves. But inside, it was profoundly quiet. "You're good with a needle," he said, his voice startling her. She looked up. "My mother taught me. She said a woman should know how to mend what's broken." He grunted, a sound of acknowledgement. She was right. He stayed for almost an hour. Neither of them spoke again, but his presence was not an intrusion. It was a comfort. It was the quiet of two people who understood loneliness. She was aware of his size, of the sheer, solid presence of him. He was aware of her, the small, quick movements of her hands. It was the most intimate moment she had shared with another person since David's death. The peace was shattered a week after she arrived. Another storm blew in, this one from the north, a furious squall of wind and lightning. It came on fast. The sky turned a sickly, greenish-black in the middle of the afternoon. The first gust of wind hit the barn so hard the entire structure groaned. Then came the thunder. Not a rumble, but a sharp, violent crack directly overhead that sounded like the sky splitting in two. Helen was in the stall with Stubbs, trying to calm the frightened animal. The rain began, a deafening, horizontal assault on the wooden roof. Another flash of lightning lit the barn's interior in a stark, terrifying white, followed instantly by a crash of thunder so loud it shook the floor. Helen dropped the feed bucket. Her knees buckled. She wasn't in the barn. She was back in the cabin, the wind screaming, the walls shaking. She was back in that frozen field, staring at David's body. She stumbled out of the stall and pressed herself against the solid main wall, sliding down until she was huddled on the floor. She couldn't breathe. The wind was a shriek, the same shriek that had stolen her husband. She put her hands over her ears, curling into a tight ball, trying to make herself small, trying to disappear. The shaking started, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that racked her entire body. The barn door was ripped open, slamming against the outer wall. Silas stood there, framed against the driving rain. His coat soaked, his hat pulled low. He must have run from the house to check on the animals, or perhaps on her. He saw her immediately. A small, terrified huddle in the corner. In 3 long strides, he was across the barn. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't hesitate. He tore off his heavy, oiled canvas duster, the inside of it still dry and warm. He crouched in front of her and, in one swift, sure movement, wrapped it tightly around her, pulling her against the solid wall of his chest. The embrace was not gentle. It was absolute. It was firm and grounding, an anchor in the storm. He smelled of rain and leather and the faint, clean scent of lye soap. "It's just wind, Helen," he said, his voice a low rumble, loud enough to be heard over the roar. "Just wind and water. The barn will hold. You're safe here." His words didn't register. She was trapped in the memory, shaking her head, her voice a strangled whisper. No, it's not safe. He's gone. He didn't come back. I told him not to go. He's gone." Silas went very still. His arms, which had been a shield, now held her with a different kind of intensity. "Who's gone?" he asked, his voice softer, but no less firm. The story. The one she had held inside for 6 months. The one that was poisoning her. Tore its way out. "My husband?" she gasped. The words ripped from her. "David, it was a storm. Like this. Last fall. A blue norther. It came so fast, so cold. We lost cattle. He was so afraid of the debts. He said he had to find them, or we'd lose everything." She was sobbing now. Great, dry, racking sobs that hurt her chest. She clung to the front of his shirt. "I begged him not to go. I told him the cattle weren't worth his life, but he wouldn't listen. He rode out into it, and I stayed behind. I stayed in the warm cabin and I prayed. I prayed all night. I prayed until my knees were raw. And in the morning, I found him, a mile from the house. His horse had slipped on the ice. He was frozen. And the cattle were gone anyway." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes blind with a guilt that was eating her alive. "I stayed inside. I let him go. I just prayed, and my prayers did nothing." She expected to see pity in his eyes, or judgment. Instead, she saw a flicker of a pain so deep it startled her. The scar on his face seemed to pull tight. He looked away from her, up into the dark, storm-thrashed rafters of his own barn. "Prayer," he said, his voice rough, thick with an old, cold anger. "It doesn't stop the fire either." Helen's sobs hitched. She stared at him. He spoke to the rafters, not to her. "I had a fiancée years ago. Her name was Eliza." He said the name as if it hurt his mouth. "I was gone, on a cattle drive to Kansas. Gone for 3 months. I was doing it for her, to get the money to build her a proper house. The house, the one on the hill." He swallowed, his throat working. "While I was gone, there was a fire. Started right here, in this barn. A lantern tipped over. It went up like a torch. She was in here, tending a sick horse." He looked back down at Helen, and his eyes were hollow, haunted by a guilt that was a perfect, terrible mirror of her own. "She died, in the fire, while I was 100 miles away, counting cattle and dreaming of the future. I wasn't there to pull her out. I was gone, chasing a profit." His voice dropped to a raw whisper. "I survived. I came back and built her house, and I've never spent a single night in it." The thunder rolled. Distant now. The rain softened, but inside the barn, the air was charged, thick with their 2 confessions. They were no longer a rancher and a widow. They were 2 survivors, the one who left and the one who stayed, both trapped by the ghosts of what they couldn't prevent. Helen's trembling had stopped, replaced by a profound, aching recognition. She looked at him, really saw him. The scars on his face were nothing compared to the one he carried inside. Her hand, free of the duster, lifted. It was an involuntary movement, An impulse to comfort, to connect. She wanted to touch his face, to trace the line of the old burn. "You survived," she whispered. "So did you," he answered, his voice hoarse. He was still crouched in front of her, his face inches from hers. She could feel his breath, warm and steady, on her skin. His gaze, intense and unguarded, dropped from her eyes to her mouth. Slowly, as if moving against a great weight, his gloved hand lifted to her face. His thumb, rough leather, brushed a tear track from her cheek. The touch was a jolt, a spark of heat that shot through her. It was not just comfort. It was something else, something sharp and needy and alive. He leaned in, his eyes dark with a longing that matched her own. She felt her own body tilt toward him, drawn by a gravity she couldn't fight. His fingers brushed her jaw. Their breath mingled. Then, the reality of it crashed over her. Shame, hot and total. David, her husband, buried on a cold hill. She was in another man's arms, in another man's barn, taking his charity and, God help her, wanting his touch. She flinched, pulling back as if she'd been struck. She turned her head, hiding her face, burying it in the folds of his duster that still covered her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, ashamed of her longing, ashamed of her weakness. "I shouldn't, Silas froze. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by the familiar, shuttered look. He pulled his hand back as if her skin had burned him. He stood up abruptly, towering over her, putting distance between them. He was the master of the ranch again. The moment of connection was gone, erased. He walked to the stall, picked up the feed bucket she had dropped, and set it upright with a thud. "The storm's passing," he said, his voice flat. All emotion scoured from it. "Don't let the calf get a chill." He strode to the door, pulling it open. The air that washed in was cold and clean. He stepped out into the dying rain, pulling the heavy door shut behind him, leaving Helen alone in the near dark, wrapped in the scent of him, shaking for an entirely different reason. After the storm and the confession, an uneasy truce settled over the barn. Silas retreated. He was a man who had revealed a crack in his armor, and he responded by sealing it up, twice as thick. He returned to leaving food by the door before dawn, avoiding her, his presence reduced to the sound of his boots on the gravel outside. Helen understood. She, too, was raw, exposed. That moment of shared guilt had felt like a betrayal of her grief for David, and his for Eliza, and the longing, the desperate, brief flicker of desire, had shamed her. But she would not be idle. The calf, Stubbs, was thriving. The tack was clean. The fence was mended. She was earning her keep, but it felt solitary. She was still the woman in the barn, separate from the ranch. The Boone Ranch was a large operation, employing a dozen hands who bunked together in a long, low building 100 yards from the barn. They were a rough, solitary crew, managed by a foreman named Amos, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and wind. They managed their own cookhouse, a slapdash affair that mostly produced burnt beans and hard biscuits. Helen saw her next task. She was not a guest. She was an employee. She waited for Silas one afternoon, catching him as he was checking the grain stores. "Mr. Boone, I need supplies." He stopped, turning. "I've left coffee." "No," she said, her voice firm. "I mean supplies. Flour, lard, beans, salt pork. For the men. The cookhouse is a mess. I can do better. It will be part of my keep." He assessed her. He was weighing the implications. Her, interacting with his men. Her, moving from the isolation of the barn to the center of the ranch's operations. He seemed to war with himself, his protective instinct fighting his practicality. "Amos handles the provisions," he said, deflecting. "Amos handles cattle," Helen countered, surprised by her own boldness. "I handle kitchens." A long silence. He gave a single, curt nod. "I will have Mr. Miller send a delivery from the mercantile. Give me a list." It was a victory. It felt like one. The next day, a wagon from Miller's arrived. Helen, with a feeling of purpose she had not known in a year. Took inventory. She scoured the filthy cookhouse, whitewashed the walls, and by evening had a fire roaring. When the men rode in, exhausted and caked in dust, they were not met with the usual smell of cold grease. They were met with the scent of fresh bread, a thick beef and barley stew, and strong, hot coffee. They filed in, one by one, tin plates in hand. They were wary. They looked at her, this small, quiet woman who had appeared from nowhere. They looked at the food. They looked at each other. They were men of few words. "Evening, ma'am," Amos, the foreman, said, nodding. He was the first to dip his ladle into the stew. The other men followed, shuffling past her, murmuring ma'am or just nodding. Their eyes cast down. They ate sitting on the benches, the silence broken only by the scrape of spoons on tin. They ate everything. They came back for more. When they left, they stacked their plates neatly, a gesture of respect she had not expected. Helen felt a warmth she recognized as belonging. She was no longer just the widow. She was the cook. She settled into this new rhythm. Up before dawn, she would leave the barn and walk to the cookhouse. She baked bread, stewed meats, and made the supplies from Silas stretch further than any of the men had thought possible. Silas himself never ate there. He remained in his house, a dark silhouette on the hill, but he saw he had to. A few weeks into this new arrangement, Amos stopped by the cookhouse while she was kneading dough. "Ma'am," he said, rolling the brim of his hat in his hands. "Amos, you're early for supper." I came to speak to the boss. He's up at the main house." He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm worried on his account, ma'am." Helen stopped kneading, her hands white with flour. "Is something wrong?" "It's the talk," he said, lowering his voice. "The men, they're grateful. Never eaten better. They respect you, but a widow, living in the barn, even with you in here, working, it stirs gossip. When the boys go to town for a drink, they hear it. Mr. Boone. He don't care about talk, but it ain't good for the ranch. Ain't good for him." Helen felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, heavier than the dough under her hands. "What kind of talk, Amos?" "Just talk, ma'am, that the rich cowboy is hiding a woman, that it ain't proper. You know how people are." She did know. She had seen it in Mr. Miller's eyes, in the leers of the men at the saloon. She had just hoped, foolishly, that her hard work would erase it. "I am earning my keep," she said, her voice quiet but fierce. "I know it, ma'am." And Mr. Boone knows it, but the world, it only sees what it wants to see. He put his hat back on. He's a good man, Mr. Boone, stubborn as a mule in a blizzard. He won't say nothing, but this talk, it ain't good. He left her standing in the cookhouse, the smell of rising bread suddenly sickening. The dread Amos had planted in her grew all week. She began to feel the stares of the ranch hands again, even though they were kind. Were they wondering? Were they laughing at her, at him, behind their hands? She needed supplies. She had been putting it off, letting Amos fetch them, but they were out of salt and coffee, and she needed to see Mr. Miller about a standing order of potatoes. She tied Bess to the wagon, the one with the mended axle, and drove into the settlement. The air at the mercantile had changed. The last time, she had been a pitiful, half-drowned object of scorn. Now, she was a curiosity. Mr. Miller was almost fawning, tripping over himself to fill her order. "And this is all on Mr. Boone's account." "Yes, Mrs. McCrae? Of course. Anything you need. Anything at all." His politeness was oily, worse than his refusal had been. The men at the bar were silent, but their eyes followed her, speculative and knowing. She was Boone's woman. That's what their eyes said. She finished her business, loading the heavy sacks onto the wagon, her face burning. She just wanted to get back to the barn, to her sanctuary. "Mrs. McCrae." The voice was sharp, cold, and righteous. Helen turned. It was Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife, a pillar of the small church congregation. She was a tall woman, dressed in severe black, her face pinched in a permanent state of disapproval. She was flanked by two other women, who looked at Helen as if she were something scraped from a boot. "Mrs. Gable," Helen acknowledged, inclining her head. "I have been asked by the good women of this community to speak with you." "Mrs. Gable began, her voice loud enough for the men on the mercantile porch to hear. "We are concerned for your soul and for the moral hygiene of our town." Helen froze, her hand on the wagon rail. "I don't know what you mean." "Do not play the innocent, madam. It does not become you." "Mrs. Gable took a step closer. "You are living, unmarried, under the protection of Silas Boone. You sleep in his barn. You take his provision. You, a widow not yet a year in her grief, are openly flaunting your sin." The word struck Helen like a physical blow. Sin. She thought of the cold, starving night. She thought of mucking stalls, of mending fences, of the burns on her hands from the cookhouse stove. "I work for Mr. Boone," Helen said, her voice shaking with a cold rage. "I am his cook. I earn my keep. Cook." "Mrs." Gable let out a short, sharp laugh. "Is that what you call it? We know what kind of work a woman like you does for a man like him. You are a stain, Helen McCrae. A disgrace to the memory of your poor husband. You are living in sin, and you are dragging a good man's name, a recluse, but a good man, down with you." The humiliation was total. It was public. The men on the porch were watching, some with pity, most with smug interest. Helen felt the blood drain from her face. She had fought the storm. She had fought starvation, but she could not fight this. This was a poison she could not purge. She did not answer. She could not. She climbed onto the wagon seat, her movements stiff and wooden. She slapped the reins, and Bess, startled, lurched the wagon forward. She did not look back. She kept her spine straight until the settlement was a mile behind her, but the tears blurred the trail, hot and stinging. She had brought shame to him. Amos was right. She was a burden. She had thought she was rebuilding her life, but she had only been building a scandal. She reached the ranch as a cold, driving rain began to fall, the third storm she had faced, each one worse than the last. She did not go to the cookhouse. She did not unhitch Bess. She drove the wagon straight to the barn, the wagon that still held her few belongings from her old life. She would not stay another night. She would not be his shame. She would rather freeze in the wilderness. She would rather starve than bear the title Mrs. Gable had given her. She jumped down from the wagon, the rain already soaking her dress. She ran inside the barn, to her canvas-walled corner. She grabbed her mother's Bible, the broken photograph. She pulled the blankets Silas had given her from the hay and threw them onto the floor. She would take nothing that was his. "What are you doing?" His voice. She spun around. Silas was standing in the center of the barn, dripping wet, his hat in his hand. He must have seen her drive the wagon in. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice choked with tears and rage. "I'm leaving now. I will not be your whore." The ugly word hung in the air between them, stark and violent. His face, usually so controlled, darkened with a sudden, dangerous anger. "What did you say?" Mrs. Gable, in town. She said, they all think I am your kept woman, that I am living in sin. I will not do it. Silas, I will not bring this on you." She threw her blanket toward the wagon. "I won't be your shame." "Shame." He moved, so fast she didn't have time to react. He crossed the barn in 3 strides, the rain and mud flying from his boots. He grabbed her arm, not gently. "You think I care about the rattling tongues of old women?" "It matters," she cried, trying to pull away from him. "It matters to me. I have nothing left in this world but my name." And she spat on it, and she spat on yours. "Let them." His grip tightened. The wind tore at the barn door, rattling it, the rain lashing against the wood. He was breathing hard, the fury rolling off him. "You think I brought you here to be a kept woman?" "I don't know what to think. I only know what they say. I am the widow in the barn. It's wrong. He dragged her. He pulled her out of her canvas corner, out into the middle of the barn, toward the door. She thought he was throwing her out. He kicked the door shut with his boot, plunging the barn into near darkness. The only light coming from the high, gray windows. The roar of the storm was muffled, but the tension inside was electric. He let go of her arm only to grab her shoulders, forcing her to face him. He was soaked. She was soaked. They stood less than a foot apart, water dripping from his hair onto her face. "You are not leaving," he said, his voice a low command. "You are not running from this. You earned your place here. You earned it with your hands, in the mud, with that calf. You earned it in the cookhouse. This place is yours. You don't owe anyone shame." His words hit her harder than the accusations had. You don't owe anyone shame. He was defending her. But it was more than that. The fury in his eyes was not just for Mrs. Gable. It was for her, and it was tangled up with the desperation she had seen in the last storm. "Silas," she whispered, her resolve crumbling, her whole body shaking. "I do not care what they say," he growled. Their hands, which had been gripping, softened. His hold on her shoulders eased, becoming something that was not a restraint, but a connection. Her hands were on his wet shirt, though she didn't remember putting them there. "You should," she whispered, looking down. "A man like you." "A man like me is a damn fool," he said, his voice raw. He had been wearing his work gloves. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up with one hand and pulled the wet leather from the other, finger by finger. He tossed the glove to the ground. Then he lifted his bare, scarred hand. He hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly. He laid his hand against her cheek. His skin was rough, calloused, but it was warm. The scars were raised, and she felt them against her own skin. It was the most terrifying, most tender thing she had ever felt. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing. "Helen," he breathed, and then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was the kiss of a man starved, a man who had held himself back for too long. It was harsh and desperate and full of all the rage and loneliness from the storm. It was salt from the rain, and the taste of his skin, and the scent of leather and wet wool. It was acclaiming, and she did not stop him. She kissed him back. She clung to him, her hands moving from his chest to his shoulders, pulling him closer. All the shame, the grief, the humiliation, it all dissolved, burned away by a sudden, sharp, undeniable want. This was not sin. This was survival. He pushed his other hand into her wet hair, tilting her head, deepening the kiss. He backed her against one of the massive support timbers, pressing her against the solid wood, his body a shield against the world. The kiss went on until they were both breathless, shaking. He broke away, resting his forehead against hers, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His eyes were closed. "God help me. Helen," he whispered. He didn't move away. He just held her there, pinned between his body and the post, as if he were afraid she would dissolve. She looked at him, at the scarred face, the intense, haunted eyes that were now dark with a hunger she recognized. The barn was silent save for their breathing and the drumming rain. The air between them was thick, pulsing with what they had just done. He moved, his hand sliding from her shoulder down her arm, his thumb brushing the pulse at her wrist. He started to pull her, gently this time, toward her canvas corner, toward the bed of hay. The desire was a physical ache in her belly. She wanted it. She wanted him. She wanted to erase the cold, the loss, the judgment. But as he pulled her, the face of Mrs. Gable flashed in her mind. Pity, kept woman, and the face of David, frozen in the snow. She stopped. She put her hand flat on his chest, a barrier. He looked at her, confused. The desire in his eyes clouded. "Not yet," she whispered, her voice unsteady but clear. "Silas, not yet." He frowned. "Helen, not like this," she said, pleading with him to understand. "Not out of anger, not because of them." She looked down, gathering her courage. "And not out of pity." She saw the word land, saw him flinch. He knew what she meant. She was the lost cause, the half-drowned woman he had carried from the wagon. He stepped back. The heat between them vanished, replaced by a cold, frustrated understanding. He scrubbed his hand over his face, over the scars. He was the rancher again, the master of himself. "Right," he said, his voice flat. He took a deep, steadying breath. "You're right." He did not leave the barn. He walked to the main door, checking the latch that he had kicked shut. He walked the perimeter, his boots echoing on the packed earth. He was guarding her. He picked up one of his own blankets from a pile he kept for the horses, walked to the far side of the barn, near the grain bins, and sat down, his back against the wall. He was 20 yards from her canvas room, but his presence filled the entire space. They slept near each other, but not together. Helen lay in her own haybed, her body thrumming, her lips still burning from his kiss. The desire was a heavy, living thing in the darkness, pulsing between them, held back only by her words. The next morning, the air was clean, washed by the rain. She woke, afraid he would be gone, that the awkwardness would be unbearable. He was standing outside the barn door, in the bright, cold sunlight. She came out, shielding her eyes. He was not looking at her, but at the patch of muddy ground beside the barn wall. "Mr. Boone," she said softly. He turned. He looked tired. He held something in his hand. "Silas," he corrected her, his voice quiet. "My name is Silas." He held out his hand. It was a small cloth sack. "The soil is good here," he said, gesturing to the ground, protected from the wind. She opened the sack. It was full of seeds, tiny, dark specks. "What are they?" "Wildflowers," he said. "Indian paintbrush, lupine, some columbine. They're hardy." He looked at her, his gaze steady. All the desperation from the night before banked, replaced by a quiet sincerity. "You should plant a garden, outside the barn." Helen looked from the seeds, to the patch of earth, to his face. He was not offering her a night of passion. He was offering her a future. He was telling her, in the only way he knew how, to stay, to put down roots. She closed her hand around the seeds. "Yes," she said, "I will." The moment of peace, of shared understanding, was broken by the sound of a horse and buggy. A man in a town suit, Mr. Hargrove, the banker, was driving up the ridge at an unseemly hour. He pulled to a stop, looking nervously from Silas to Helen and back. "Boone, sorry to call so early. We have a problem." Silas was instantly on guard. "What problem?" "It's the squatters," Hargrove said, climbing down, clutching his briefcase. "They're moving onto the South Ridge, claiming plots. The land office is a disaster, and they're taking advantage. I'll have Amos and the boys run them off," Silas said, his voice hard. "It's not that simple." Hargrove looked at Helen, then back at Silas. "One of them. He's not just squatting. He's filed a claim, a proxy claim, based on an outstanding debt." Helen felt a cold premonition, the seeds suddenly heavy in her hand. "A man named Elias Holt," Hargrove said. Helen's breath hitched. Elias Holt, David's cousin. A mean, grasping man she had met only twice, who had looked at her homestead with greedy eyes. "He claims," Hargrove continued, reading from a paper, "that your late husband, David McCrae, owed him $500. He says he has the note. He's laying claim to the original McCrae homestead, which, since it defaulted, reverted to your larger grazing territory. He's using the debt to claim your land. Boone." "He's a liar," Helen said, her voice sharp. "David never borrowed from him." "He says he has the paper. Mrs. McCrae," Hargrove said nervously. "And he says you're responsible for the debt." "This is blackmail," Silas said, his voice a low growl. He looked at Helen, then at the banker. "How much?" "He's claiming $500, plus interest." Silas didn't hesitate. He started to reach into his coat, for the wallet he kept there. "I'll pay it. Get him off my land." "No." Both men turned to look at her. "No," Helen said again, louder this time. She stepped forward, the sack of seeds still clenched in her fist. "Mr. Hargrove, you tell Elias Holt that this is my debt, and my name. Not Mr. Boone's. I will not have it paid." Silas stared at her, his hand frozen. "Helen, this is foolishness. It's a land grab." "It's my name," she insisted, her pride, the one thing she had left, rising like a wall. "I will not be bought. I will not trade Mrs. Gable's rumors for the truth. If I let you pay this, I am your kept woman. I will not." "He'll take the land." "Helen," Hargrove warned. "Let him try," she said, looking straight at Silas. "This is my fight, not yours." $500. The sum was a mountain, impossibly tall, and Helen had nothing but her bare, blistered hands to climb it. After Mr. Hargrove left, Silas had stood there, his jaw tight, his wallet still in his coat. "Helen," he said, his voice a low, frustrated rumble. "This is not your fight. It is a legal trick. Let me end it." "And prove Elias right," she countered, the wildflower seeds still clutched in her hand. "Prove to the whole town that I am your property, bought and paid for? No, I will not. This is not pride. This is foolishness. You cannot earn that much money." "I can work," she said, her own stubbornness rising to meet his. "I have been working. I will continue to work." He watched her, his scarred face a mask of anger and something else, something that looked almost like admiration. He did not try to stop her again, he just nodded, a single, sharp dip of his chin, and turned, striding up the hill to his empty house. He would let her try. He would let her fail. She started that very day. She began with what she knew. She went to the settlement, but this time, she did not go to Mr. Miller. She went to Mrs. Gable. She knocked on the banker's wife's door, her stomach a cold knot of dread. Mrs. Gable opened it, her expression souring when she saw who it was. "What do you want?" she snapped. "Work," Helen said, forcing the word out. "You said I was idle. You were wrong, but I need more work. I will take in your mending, sewing, darning, anything. I sew a fine stitch." Mrs. Gable looked at her, surprised, and then a slow, cruel smile touched her lips. She saw a chance to dole out both penance and charity. "Very well. I believe in the redemption of hard work. Mrs. McCrae, a quarter for a shirt, a penny for a pair of socks." The price was theft, but Helen nodded. "Thank you." Word spread. The churchwomen, eager to be part of Helen's rehabilitation, began sending their mending. She would walk back to the barn each evening, her arms full of torn shirts, ripped dresses, and threadbare stockings. She worked by lantern light in her canvas corner, long after the ranch hands were asleep. She stitched and darned until her eyes burned and her vision blurred. The single candle she allowed herself guttered low, the smell of tallow thick in the air. Her fingers, already calloused from the cookhouse, began to split and bleed. After a week of this, she had earned $3.40. It was not enough. She went to Amos, the foreman. "I need more. What else can I do?" Amos looked at her hands, at the dark circles under her eyes. He felt a deep, abiding pity for her, and for his boss, who was watching this slow self-destruction from his porch on the hill. "The tack is all clean, ma'am," he said gently. "Then I'll mend what's broken," she insisted. "The saddles, the harnesses, show me how." He was reluctant. It was hard, filthy work, but he saw the desperation in her eyes and relented. He took her to the harness shed, a place that smelled of oil, old leather, and horse sweat. He gave her a stitch-awl, a spool of waxed thread, and a block of beeswax. "It's not like sewing a shirt," he warned. "You gotta punch every hole. The thread will cut your hands if you don't wrap 'em." She learned. The leather was tough as wood, resisting the awl. She had to put her whole weight into it. The waxed thread was sticky, and it did cut her. The blisters on her palms tore open, bled, and formed new, harder calluses. She worked until her shoulders and back were a single, screaming ache. The ranch hands watched her, their respect growing. They would stop by, leaving her a cup of coffee or a piece of jerky, their silent offerings of support. Silas watched, too. He never came to the harness shed, but she would feel his eyes on her as she crossed the yard, and when she returned to the barn at night, she would find a new, brighter lantern on her crate, or a tin of salve for her hands, left there in the dark like all his other gifts. After 2 weeks, she had added another $9 to her $10. She had barely $13. $500 was a lifetime away. Desperation made her walk back into the one place she had sworn she would never go, the saloon. She found Mr. Miller behind his counter. "I need a paying job. Mr. Miller, a real one." He looked at her, at the grime on her dress, the raw state of her hands. She was no longer the pitiful widow. She was something harder, something that scared him a little. "I still ain't got help to hire. Helen." "Your saloon kitchen," she said, her voice flat. "Your potboy quit last week. I heard it in town. I'll do it, whatever you pay him." Miller was shocked. That was the lowest, filthiest job in the settlement. "Helen, that's no place for you. I am not asking for your opinion." "Mr. Miller, I'm asking for the wage." "How much?" $1 a day," he mumbled, ashamed. "And your meals." "I'll start now," she said. The kitchen was a small, hot corner of hell behind the swinging saloon doors. It was run by a man named Pete, a large, sweaty cook with a perpetually foul temper and fouler apron. Her job was to wash the heavy, grease-caked pots, scrub the floor, haul water, and carry out the heavy buckets of slop for the pigs. The heat was stifling. The smell of stale beer, old grease, and unwashed bodies clung to everything. But the worst part was the men. The swinging doors offered a clear view of the saloon floor. The drovers, prospectors, and buffalo hunters who drank there saw her. They knew her. She was Boone's woman, the widow from the barn. And now she was here, on her knees, scrubbing their filth. They leered. They made comments, loud enough for her to hear. "Look at that, too proud for charity, but not too proud for this. Maybe she's earning her $500 $1 at a time, eh?" "Hey, sweetheart," a drunken cowboy called out. "I got $1 for you. You don't gotta wash no floor for it." Helen kept her head down. She scrubbed. She hauled. She did not let them see her cry. Her humiliation was a suit of armor. She worked for 3 days. On the 3rd night, a group of freighters, half mad with whiskey, stumbled in. One of them, a massive man with a beard caked with food, saw her wrestling a heavy pot. He lurched into the kitchen, blocking her path. "Well, looky here," he slurred, grabbing her arm. "The angel of the barn, you look tired. Angel, why don't you come have a drink with me?" "Let go of me," Helen said, her voice a low, dangerous command. "Ah, she's feisty." He laughed, pulling her closer. "I like feisty." Pete, the cook, saw it and turned his back, tending to his frying pan. Mr. Miller was busy at the bar. She was alone. Rage, cold and pure, unlike anything she had ever felt, surged through her. She dropped the pot, which clanged on the floor. With her free hand, she grabbed the long-handled spoon from the pot of boiling stew on the stove and swung it. She struck him across the face with the heavy wooden spoon, leaving a streak of hot gravy. He roared, more in surprise than pain, and let her go. He raised his hand to strike her. Helen didn't flinch. She just stood there, holding the spoon like a club, ready to swing again. Her eyes were flat, dead, and unafraid. The man stared at her, his drunken haze clearing just enough to see the woman in front of him. She was not a victim. She was a survivor, and she was done. He lowered his hand, grumbled a curse, and turned, stumbling back into the bar. Helen stood there, shaking, the spoon still in her hand. The smell of the stew made her stomach turn. She dropped the spoon. She looked at Pete, who was watching her now, a new, grudging respect in his eyes. She looked at Mr. Miller, who was pretending not to see. She calmly untied her apron, an apron stained with grease and slop, and dropped it on the floor. She walked past the leering, silent men at the bar, out the front door, and into the cold night air. She left the $3 she had earned on the counter. She would not take their money. She did not ride the wagon. She had walked to town. Now she walked back, the miles stretching out in the darkness. She was not just tired. She was empty. She had failed. She had swallowed her pride, endured the stares, the insults, the filth, and she was no closer to saving her name. She had earned nothing. She was nothing. She stumbled back to the ranch, avoiding the light of the bunkhouse and the cookhouse. She did not go into the barn, into her small, safe corner. She could not bear it. She walked past it, to the small, dark patch of earth behind the barn, the place where she had planted his wildflower seeds. She sank to the ground, her back against the rough wood, and buried her face in her hands. Her hands, they were a ruin, blistered, cut, the nails broken, the knuckles raw. They were the hands of a field worker, a scrub woman. She looked at them in the pale moonlight, and they were the symbol of her failure. She finally broke. She did not wail or sob. It was a silent, racking despair, her shoulders shaking, the tears dripping through her fingers onto the cold dirt. She had fought so hard, and she had lost. Elias had won. Mrs. Gable had won. The world had won. She did not hear him approach. His boots made no sound on the soft earth. She only knew he was there when his large, dark shape blocked the moon. He did not speak. He did not ask her what was wrong. He knew. He had been on his porch, watching, waiting for her to come home. He had seen her walk past the barn, had seen her collapse. He sat on the ground beside her, not close enough to touch, but near enough that she could feel the heat of him. He just sat, a solid, patient shadow, letting her cry. He offered her the dignity of her grief. When the last of the shudders had passed, she was left limp, a hollowed-out thing. She wiped her face on the sleeve of her dress. "I failed," she whispered to the darkness. I can't do it." He still said nothing. He reached out, his gloved hand finding hers in the dark. He lifted it. He pulled off his glove, and with his bare, scarred fingers, he gently, carefully, examined her hand. He traced the blisters, the new, raw cut on her palm, the broken nails. His touch was so tender it almost made her cry again. Then, with that same slow, deliberate motion, he pulled her. He did not ask. He just pulled her to him, shifting his body so she was leaning against his chest, her head tucked under his chin. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her securely, his coat rough against her cheek. It was not the desperate, angry embrace in the rain. It was not the hesitant, protective gesture in the storm. This was the first time he had held her without restraint, without anger or fear. He was simply holding her, absorbing her pain, offering his strength as a shield. They sat like that for a long time, the silence of the high plains wrapping around them. Finally, she pulled back just enough to look up at his shadowed face. "Why?" she whispered, her voice raw. "Why do you do this?" "I am nothing but trouble. I brought shame, and now this debt. Any other man would have thrown me out weeks ago. Why do you help me?" He looked down at her, his gaze so intense it was almost a physical touch. The moonlight caught the scarred side of his face, the fierce, sad line of his mouth. He was quiet for a long time, as if searching for words he did not use often. "Because when I look at you," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur that seemed to come from the earth itself, "I don't see ruin." He paused, his thumb stroking the back of her ruined hand. "I see something I still want to believe in." The words hung in the air, simple and profound. It was not pity. It was not charity. It was faith. He believed in her, the wall she had built around her heart, the one that had survived David's death, the storm, the humiliation. It crumbled. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. She was unsteady, exhausted. He did not release her. He kept one arm around her waist, supporting her, and led her into the barn. He did not stop at her canvas corner, her small, cold bed of hay. He led her past it, to the ladder that climbed into the darkness of the hayloft. "Silas," she whispered, half in protest, half in question. "It's warmer up there," he said simply. He climbed first, then reached down, his large, strong hand closing around her wrist, and he easily pulled her up into the vast, open space. The hayloft was a different world. It was high above the ground, insulated by tons of sweet, dry hay. A large, circular window at the far end let in a perfect, silver dollar of moonlight, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was quiet, peaceful, and felt utterly removed from the world, from debts and from judgment. He led her to a deep pile of clean, loose hay in the very center, where the moonlight pooled. He turned to face her. There was a question in his eyes, the same one she had seen and fled from before. This time, she did not run. She had no pride left. She had only a deep, aching need to be seen, to be held by the one person who saw her not as a ruin, but as a reason to believe. She gave him her answer. She lifted her broken hands and laid them on his chest. His own hands, scarred and gentle, came up to her face. He was hesitant, almost awed, as if he were touching something impossibly fragile. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, angry kiss in the rain. It was slow and deep and full of a profound, unspoken emotion. He worshipped her. He undressed her with a reverence that made her want to weep, his rough fingers slow and careful on the buttons of her worn dress. He kissed her eyelids. He kissed her hair. And when she stood before him, pale in the moonlight, he knelt. He took her blistered, ruined hands in his and he kissed her palms, one after the other, a gesture of absolute devotion. He saw her body not as a temptation, but as something precious. He traced the line of her collarbone, the curve of her waist, as if memorizing her, and she, in turn, reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the map of his scars. Not with pity, but with a matching tenderness. She was not afraid of his damage. That night, in the hayloft, they made love. It was slow and quiet and almost hesitant. Two people who had forgotten how to be gentle, relearning the language of touch. It was not a fire, it was a deep, healing warmth, a slow, emotional unfolding. It was two broken, solitary souls finding a sanctuary in each other. Helen woke just before dawn, to the sound of a meadowlark. She was tangled in blankets she didn't remember him fetching, her body warm, her head resting on Silas's chest, his arm a heavy, protective weight across her waist. He was still asleep, his face in the gray light, unguarded and peaceful. The peace was so complete, so terrifyingly real, that her heart seized. This was not just a night of comfort. This was real, and anything real could be lost. She felt the tears come, hot and silent. She had lost her home. She had lost her husband. She had built a new, fragile life. And now she had this. She had him. And the thought of losing him, of this peace being torn away, was more than she could bear. She began to weep, not from regret, but from a profound, paralyzing fear. Her small movement woke him. He was instantly alert, his body tensing. He felt her tears on his skin. "Helen?" His voice was thick with sleep. He sat up, pulling her with him. Are you regret?" She shook her head, clutching his hand, the one she had held all night. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No, not regret. I'm afraid." "Afraid of what? Of me? Of this?" She gestured between them, at the hay, at the quiet. "Of losing it, of losing you. I lost everything once. Silas, I can't survive it again." He looked at her, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name. He pulled her against him, his hand burying itself in her hair. "You are not losing me. Helen, I am not." "Boone, get out here. Boone, and bring your whore with you." The voice from below was harsh, nasal, and full of venom. Elias Holt. The peace of the hayloft shattered. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his face a mask of cold fury. He pulled on his trousers, his movements quick and violent. Helen scrambled for her dress. her hands shaking so badly she could barely manage the buttons. "He's here. Oh, God, he's here. Stay up here," Silas commanded. "No," she said, her fear replaced by a sudden, cold resolve. "He called my name. I'll face him." She followed him down the ladder. Elias Holt was standing just outside the massive barn door, which was wide open, letting in the cold morning light. He was not alone. He had the two rough-looking men from before, and standing beside him, looking profoundly uncomfortable, was Marshall Cobb. Amos and 3 of the ranch hands were gathered by the bunkhouse, holding rifles, watching. Elia saw Helen, her hair unbound, her dress hastily buttoned, climbing down the ladder from the hayloft, followed by Silas, bare-chested and armed with a cold fury. Elias's thin face twisted into a triumphant, ugly sneer. "Well, well, Marshall, what did I tell you? Looks like I interrupted their cozy little nest." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "She's his kept woman, plain as day." Helen flushed, a deep, painful red. She stepped forward, but Silas put his arm out, barring her way. Elias waved the promissory note. "I'm here for my money, Helen, or I'm taking the land. The judge gave me 30 days. My time is up. Pay me, or maybe your new friend will." He leered at Silas. "She must be worth $500. Eh, Boone, for services rendered?" "You will be silent," Silas said. His voice was not loud. It was deadly. He stepped forward, moving between Helen and the men. He ignored Elias, addressing the marshal directly. "Marshal Cobb, this man is on my property, threatening a person under my roof." "Now, Silas," the marshal said, holding up a hand. "He has a claim. The paper looks legal. He says the debt's unpaid." "It's a forgery," Helen cried from behind him. "David never borrowed that money." Silas held up a hand, a quiet gesture for her to be still. He never took his eyes off the marshal. The entire yard was silent, watching. "This is not about money," Silas announced, his voice carrying in the clear, cold air. "And it is not about land." He turned, not just to the marshal, but to his own men, and to Elias. It was a public declaration. "Mrs. Helen McCrae is under my protection. Any man who harasses her, insults her, or attempts to defraud her, answers directly to me." The words were a shield. Helen felt the power of them, a solid wall at her back. Elias laughed, a high, ugly sound. "So you admit it? She is your woman, shacking her up in your barn, like an animal. You've claimed her, have you?" Silas's gaze snapped to Elias, cold and flat. "No." The answer stunned everyone, including Helen. "I did not say she is my woman," Silas said, his voice precise, cutting. "I did not say she is my wife. I will not claim her name, or her choice, in front of you, or any other man." He turned his head, his gaze finding Helen's, locking with it. He was speaking to her now, though the whole world was listening. "That choice," he said, "belongs to her." He had done it. He had defended her, protected her, and, in the same breath, given her all the power. He had not claimed her. He had not saved her by making her his property. He had offered his strength, but left the choice, and her name, entirely her own. Helen stood there, trapped between the man who was threatening her past and the man who was offering her a future. She was torn. Her pride, the stubborn, fierce thing that had driven her to scrub floors and nearly starve, wanted her to stand alone, to refuse him, to fight Elias herself, even if she lost. But her heart, which she had given to him in the hayloft, ached. To accept his protection, to step forward and stand beside him, was to admit her need. To bind herself to him in front of the world, it was a surrender. She looked at Elias's hateful, triumphant face. She looked at Silas's strong, quiet one, pride or love. The choice was hers, and it had to be made now. Helen stood in the cold morning light, the world frozen in a terrible, silent tableau. Elias Holt's taunts hung in the air. The marshal's neutral gaze was a heavy weight. The ranch hands watched, their loyalty to Silas warring with their curiosity. And Silas, he had given her everything. He had protected her name, her life, her body, and now, her choice. He had turned, in front of them all, and left the decision in her hands. To step forward was to bind herself to him, to admit her love, and to accept his protection. To stay silent was to cling to the last, bitter remnants of a pride that had already cost her so much. She looked at Elias's sneering face. She looked at Marshal Cobb, who was waiting for an answer. She looked at Silas, his back to her, a solid, unmovable wall. Waiting. It was too much. The shame of the night before, the fear of Elias, the crushing weight of his public defense. It was a cage. No matter how lovingly it was built, she felt the eyes of Mrs. Gable, though she wasn't even there. She felt the eyes of the whole town. She couldn't breathe. She did the only thing she could. She turned, not to Silas, but away from all of them. And she ran. She heard Elias laugh, a sharp, ugly sound. "See, she runs! She's guilty! Marshal!" She heard Silas roar, "Helen!" His voice was not a plea. It was a command, full of anguish and fury. She didn't stop. She ran into the barn, her sanctuary. But it was not a sanctuary. It was the hayloft where she had given herself to him. It was the stall where she had saved the calf. It was the corner where she had hidden. It was his. Everything was his. Marshal Cobb stepped forward. "Silas, that's enough. This ain't a bar fight. Holt, you'll have your day in court. I'm posting the hearing for a week from today. You bring your proof, Mrs. McCrae." He called to the barn. "You'd best be there." Silas was left standing alone in the yard, his hands clenched, his declaration of love turning to ash in his mouth. Inside the barn, Helen was moving with a desperate, frantic energy. She was not running from Elias. She was running from Silas. She was running from the woman she had become, the woman who needed him. That need was a weakness. It was a chain. It would destroy him. She could not, would not, be his ruin. She grabbed the canvas sheet and tore it down. She pulled her few, pitiful belongings from the hay, the ruined Bible, the broken photograph of David, the small tin box that held $13.40, the sum total of her failed independence. She found a stub of charcoal, the one she had used for her drawings, on a scrap of brown paper used for wrapping bacon. She wrote, her hand was shaking, "I will not be your ruin. Do not follow me." She left the note on the crate, a stark, black message in the gray light. She ran to the stall. Bess, her old mule, was the only thing left that was truly hers. She threw the saddle on, her fingers fumbling with the cinch. She led the mule out the back door, the one that opened onto the high country, away from the house, away from the settlement. She mounted and kicked the mule into a stumbling trot. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to leave. She remembered hearing the freighters at the saloon talk about the mining camps to the east. Over the hills, 50 miles, they'd said. They paid high wages for cooks, for laundresses. They wouldn't care about her name. She rode into the hills, into the cold, unforgiving wilderness, disappearing into the gullies and arroyos. A ghost fleeing a life she was too afraid to claim. Silas found the note not 10 minutes later. He had stormed into the barn, his fury at Elias and his fear for Helen warring in his chest. He saw the empty corner, the canvas sheet on the floor. He saw the note, "I will not be your ruin. Do not follow me." The words were a physical blow. He crushed the paper in his fist. "Do not follow me," he whispered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He had respected her pride. He had given her a choice. And she had chosen this. She had chosen the wilderness over him. The memory of Eliza, of the fire, of being too late, rose in him, cold and suffocating. He would not be too late again. He ran from the barn, shouting for Amos. His voice was a roar that brought the hands running. "She's gone," he said, his voice flat. All emotion burned away, leaving only a cold, hard purpose. She's on the mule, heading east into the hills. Amos, you take 2 men and follow the lower ridge. Look for tracks. I'll take the high pass. She can't have more than an hour's lead." "Boss, it's rough country," Amos said, seeing the look in his employer's eyes. "A storm's blowing in from the north. She won't—" "Find her," Silas commanded. "Now." He was on his best horse, a rangy black gelding built for endurance. In less than 5 minutes, he carried a bedroll, a canteen, and a rifle. He did not look back. He rode with a reckless, focused intensity, his eyes scanning the earth, his mind a cold, calculating map of her terror. Helen pushed Bess hard. Harder than the old mule had been pushed in years. The terrain was brutal, a rocky, broken land of scrub pine and deep canyons. She was a plainswoman, and these hills confused her. Everything looked the same. By evening, the wind had risen, sharp and cold, carrying the sting of sleet. She was hopelessly lost. She had no food left but a heel of old bread. She huddled under a rocky overhang, the wind screaming around her, and, for the first time, her pride gave way to a stark, cold terror. She was going to die out here, alone, for nothing. The next day, she pushed on, her hands and feet numb. Bess was stumbling, her breath coming in ragged, white plumes. The sleet turned to a thin, wet snow. There was no trail, no sign of any mining camp, only an endless, repeating landscape of gray rock and brown scrub. On the 3rd morning, Bess went down. She slipped on a patch of ice-covered rock and fell, her leg twisting beneath her. The mule let out a pained, weary groan. Helen tried to get her up, pulling, begging, but the animal was done. Her spirit was broken. Helen sat in the snow beside the dying mule and wept. She had killed the last living link to her old life. She untied her bundle, the Bible, the photo, and began to walk. She had no direction, no hope. She was just moving, one foot in front of the other. As the snow began to fall in earnest, the cold was a thief, stealing the feeling from her body and then her mind. She found a shallow cave, a crack in a rock face, and crawled inside. She was shaking so violently she could barely hold the photograph. She curled into a tight ball, her mind clouding. The image of Silas's face in the hayloft, the last warm thing she remembered. The fever, born of cold and starvation, took her. Silas had found the mule's tracks on the 2nd day, long after he had sent Amos and the others back to the ranch. He was alone, tracking her with a grim, obsessive focus. He found Bess, still warm, the snow just beginning to cover her. The fear he had held at bay now consumed him. He was too late. He had lost her. "Helen!" His voice was a raw, broken sound in the silent, falling snow. He slid from his horse and fell to his knees, his eyes scanning the ground, and he saw it. A single, small, stumbling footprint, heading up the rocks. She was on foot. He followed the tracks, a trail of a person at the end of their endurance. They led to a fissure in a rock wall. He approached, his heart in his throat. He looked inside. She was a small, dark bundle, already half covered by drifting snow. She was perfectly still. "No," he whispered. It was a prayer. "No, not again." He reached in, his hands shaking. He touched her neck. For one agonizing second, there was nothing. Then, under his fingers, a faint, thready pulse. She was alive, but her skin was on fire. The fever, relief so profound it left him weak, washed over him. He tore his bedroll from his saddle, pulling out the heavy wool blanket. He gently, carefully, lifted her from the cave. She weighed nothing. She was a bird. She moaned, a small, delirious sound, her head falling back against his arm. He wrapped her in the blanket, then unbuttoned his own heavy duster and wrapped it around her again, sealing her inside, against his own body. He mounted his horse, holding her with one arm, his strength her only anchor. "Hold on, Helen," he murmured, his voice thick. "I have you. Just hold on." He carried her down the mountain. The journey was a slow, careful torment. He did not spare his horse, but he did not risk her. He kept his arm locked around her. her small, feverish body pressed against his chest, his own life force a shield against the cold. He rode all night, guided by instinct, his mind focused on the small, shallow breaths she took against his shirt. He arrived at the barn as the sun, a pale, watery disk, was rising. He did not go to the house. He would not take her there. That was Eliza's house, a house of ghosts. The barn was their place. He carried her inside, to her canvas corner. He laid her in the hay and built a fire in the brazier he had brought from the forge, the metal hissing as the snow melted off it. He stripped her of the frozen, wet rags she wore, his touch impersonal, clinical. He wrapped her in his own dry blankets from the house, piling them on top of her. For 2 days, he was her life. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He sat by her side, a sentinel, and fought the fever. He boiled willow bark for tea, forcing the bitter liquid between her cracked lips. He spoon-fed her warm broth he'd brought from the cookhouse, a few drops at a time. He bathed her face with a cool cloth. He held her hand, his large, scarred hand enclosing hers, as if he could will his own strength into her. He watched her, his haggard face illuminated by the fire. He watched her fight, and he understood. Her pride, the foolish, stubborn, infuriating pride that had driven her into the wilderness, was the same thing he had seen in her from the first day. It was the same thing that had saved the calf. It was the same thing that had made her scrub floors. It was who she was, and it was the thing he loved. Helen woke slowly, to the smell of hay and wood smoke. She was warm, impossibly, wonderfully warm. Her body felt distant, a heavy, aching thing, but the bone-grinding cold was gone. She opened her eyes. The barn was dim, the air soft and warm. She saw him. He was asleep in a hard-backed chair, his head slumped forward, his face covered in a dark stubble. He looked exhausted. He looked broken. The note, the mule, the snow. It all came rushing back. She had done this. She had run, and he had come for her. Her foolish pride had nearly killed her, and it had put him through this hell. She made a small sound, a dry, broken sob. He was awake instantly. His head snapped up, his eyes, bloodshot and frantic, finding hers. Helen. He was by her side in a second, his hand on her forehead, checking the fever. His touch was rough and gentle. "It's broken," he whispered, his relief palpable. "The fever's broken." Tears, hot and weak, spilled from her eyes, running into her hair. "I'm sorry," she rasped, her throat raw. "Silas, I'm so sorry. I ran. I didn't want to ruin you. Your name. What Elias said. What Mrs. Gable said. I couldn't be that. I didn't want to be your shame." He sat on the edge of her haybed, his big frame casting a shadow over her. He took her hand. It was swallowed up in his. "Ruin me?" he said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Helen, I was ruined long before you came. You think this ranch, this land, that empty house on the hill, you think that's a life?" He shook his head, his gaze sweeping around the barn. "I was a ghost. I was a man living in a tomb, just waiting. I had everything, and I had nothing. It was all just shelter, just wood and stone." He looked back at her, his eyes, dark and intense, holding hers. "Then you came, a half-drowned woman with nothing but a broken photograph and a pride so fierce it could cut a man. You fought me. You fought the land. You fought for that damn calf. You fought for your own name." He squeezed her hand. "You brought life back into this place. Helen, you took this old, empty barn and you made it a home. The barn was just shelter. But you gave it a reason to stay." His words settled over her. A truth that was warmer than the fire, more healing than the broth. He did not see her as a burden. He saw her as his reason. "Elias," she whispered, the fear still a cold ember. "He is," Silas said, his voice turning hard. "Marshal Cobb has set a hearing, in town, 2 days from now." Helen lay there, his words echoing in her. "You gave it a reason to stay." The fever was gone, and in its place was a new strength, It was not the brittle pride of before. It was a strength forged from his. She gripped his hand. "I will be there." His eyes searched her face. "You're weak. I will be there," she repeated. "But I will not go alone." A slow smile, the first one she had ever truly seen, touched his scarred face. "No," he said. "You will not. We ride together." 2 days later, the town was buzzing. The story was everywhere. Boone's woman had run, and he had ridden into a storm and brought her back. When Silas and Helen rode down the main street, every window, every doorway was full. Helen was pale, but she sat tall. Silas had given her his finest mare, a beautiful, high-strung chestnut. She wore her one dress, mended and clean. Silas rode beside her, not as a protector, but as an equal. They were a unified force. They dismounted in front of Miller's Mercantile, which was serving as the courthouse. The room was packed. Mrs. Gable and her friends were in the front row, their face rigid with disapproval. Elias Holt was at a table at the front, his lawyer beside him, a smug, confident look on his face. Judge Potter, a weary, gray-haired man who had seen too much, banged his gavel. "This is a hearing on the matter of a debt claimed by Mr. Elias Holt against the estate of Mr. David McCrae, to be paid by his widow, Mrs. Helen McCrae." The judge said, "Mr. Holt, present your claim." Elias swaggered, handing the note to the judge. "It's plain, Your Honor. $500, plus interest, signed by my cousin, David, before he passed. His widow is responsible. If she can't pay, I'll take the land, as is my right." The judge studied the paper. He looked at Helen. "Mrs. McCrae, this is a serious sum. Is this your husband's signature?" Helen stood. The room was silent. Silas was standing just behind her, his hand on the back of her chair. She did not look at him. She looked at the judge. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It is not?" A gasp went through the room. Elias jumped to his feet. "She's lying. That is a very serious accusation. Mrs. McCrae," the judge said, his eyes sharp. "Can you prove it?" "Yes," Helen said. She walked forward and placed her ruined, flood-damaged family Bible on the table. The cover was swollen, the pages a solid, fused block. "What is this?" the judge asked, frowning. "This is my mother's Bible, Your Honor. It was one of the few things I salvaged from the flood that destroyed my home. Before that, it was where my husband and I recorded our marriage. And on the inside cover, he practiced his signature, the day we filed our claim." She opened the cover. "The ink is gone, washed away by the creek, but the paper was wet for so long. The indentations from his pen remain." The judge took the book, holding it to the light, angling it. He grunted. "My husband, David," Helen continued, her voice gaining strength, "was a good man, but he was not a good speller, and he had a flaw in his hand. He could never make a proper, curved D. He always made it with a straight back and a straight line at the bottom, almost like a triangle." She pointed to the indentations. The judge nodded, tracing them. "Now, Your Honor," Helen said, pointing to Elias's note. "Please look at the D in David McCrae's name on that document." The judge put the note and the Bible side by side. The silence in the room was absolute. Elias Holt had gone the color of old milk. "The D on that note," Helen declared, "is perfect. It's a beautiful, flowing, educated curve. It is not my husband's signature. It is a forgery." Judge Potter looked up, his gaze like iron. He stared at Elias Holt for a long, terrible moment. "Mr. Holt," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I have hanged men for less. Forgery and perjury in my court are offenses I take very seriously. It's a lie," Elias stammered, backing away. "She's the liar. She—" "Marshal," the judge roared. Marshal Cobb, who had been watching with a grim satisfaction, grabbed Elias by the arm. "You're under arrest. Holt!" It was over. The room exploded into whispers. Mrs. Gable looked like she had swallowed a lemon. Helen swayed, The strength that had held her up suddenly gone. The sickness, the fear, the victory. It all hit her at once. She turned, her legs unsteady, and looked for Silas. He was right there. He had not moved. He met her gaze, his eyes full of a pride so fierce it stole her breath. He ignored the whispers. He ignored the marshal dragging a screaming Elias Holt out the door. He ignored the judge banging his gavel. He stepped forward, into the center of the room. He put his hands on her face, his bare, scarred hands, cupping her jaw, in front of everyone, in front of Mrs. Gable, in front of the entire town that had judged her, pitied her, and scorned her. He kissed her. It was not the desperate kiss in the rain, or the tender, healing kiss in the hayloft. This was a public kiss. It was a brand. It was a defiant, proud, and absolute declaration. It said everything he had refused to say in the yard. She is mine, and I am hers, and I do not care what any of you think. When he finally lifted his head, Helen was shaking, but the fear was gone. The shame was gone. The cold she had felt for almost a year was finally, truly, gone. She looked at the shocked, silent faces of the townsfolk, and she felt nothing but a distant pity for them. She had her name. She had her justice. She had her life. She reached up and took Silas's hand, the one that had held hers through the fever, and she gripped it tight. She finally accepted it all. Not just the love, but the justice. Not just the man, but the future. She was shaking, but she was whole. The ride back from the settlement was a quiet one. The victory in the makeshift courtroom felt distant, replaced by the profound, exhausted reality of what had happened. Helen rode the chestnut mare, her body still weak from the fever, but her spine straight. Silas rode beside her, his presence a solid, comforting wall. He did not crowd her, did not press. He had given her the choice in the yard, and he had given it to her again in the courtroom, and she had met it. When they reached the ranch, the sun was low, painting the hills in shades of bruised purple and gold. The hands, who had heard the news, tipped their hats, a new, deep respect in their eyes. Amos met them at the stable. "Glad you're back, ma'am," he said, and the simple words meant everything. Helen slid from the saddle, her legs weak. Silas was there, his hands steady on her waist, lifting her down. She leaned against him for just a moment, absorbing his strength. I'll see to the barn," she murmured, her old instinct telling her to retreat to her sanctuary. "No," Silas said, his voice quiet, but absolute. He did not release her. He kept his arm around her waist, supporting her. "It's time you came home." He did not lead her to the barn. He led her past it, up the gentle slope toward the dark, imposing house on the hill. The house he had built for Eliza. The house he had never lived in. His tomb. Helen's steps faltered. "Silas, I cannot. That's her house." He stopped, turning to face her. The evening light was soft, erasing the harshness of his scars, leaving only the deep, profound truth in his eyes. "It was her house," he said, his voice rough. "It was my prison. It was a pile of wood and stone, full of guilt." He reached out, his bare hand tracing the line of her jaw, the one he had held in the hayloft. "You taught me that a place is not a memory. It's just a place. You made the barn a home. I cannot live in that house, Helen, unless you're the one who walks through the door. With me." He was asking her to banish his ghosts, just as he had banished hers. She looked from his face to the house. It was a good house, solid and strong, built of stone and thick timber, but it was dark. Every window was shut. She nodded. Together, he took her hand, and they walked the last few yards. He pushed the heavy oak door open. It swung on silent, well-oiled hinges. The air inside was cold, still, and smelled of dust, old linen, and something faintly, sweetly floral, like lavender that had dried a decade ago. The furniture was massive, dark, and covered in white dust cloths, looming like pale ghosts in the twilight. It was the house of a man who had stopped living. Helen stood in the entryway, the silence pressing in on her. She felt the ghost of Eliza, a woman she had never known, a woman who had died in a fire for the man standing next to her. Silas was rigid, his body tense, his breath held. This was harder for him than facing down Elias Holt. Helen let go of his hand. She walked past him, into the center of the vast, cold parlor. She looked at the shrouded furniture. Then she walked to the nearest window, a tall pane overlooking the valley. She did not hesitate. She unlatched the heavy brass lock and pushed the window open. The evening air, sweet with sage and pine, rushed in, stirring the dust motes, making the cloth on the nearest chair flap like a sigh. The sound of the ranch below, a distant nicker from a horse, the clang of the cookhouse triangle, drifted in. Life came into the room. Helen turned back to Silas, who was watching her, his expression raw. "It's a good house, Silas," she said, her voice soft. "But it needs air and light." She walked to the nearest shrouded form and pulled the cloth free. It was a piano, its wood dark and rich. She ran a finger over the keys, a single, clear note ringing out in the stillness. Silas let out the breath he had been holding. The tension in his shoulders eased. He watched her move, this small, indomitable woman. As she walked to another window and opened it, she was not just letting in the air. She was letting him go. He crossed the room and pulled the sheet from a large, comfortable-looking sofa. Dust rose, but he didn't care. He sat, his long legs stretched out, and for the first time he looked like he belonged there. "It will need a lot of cleaning," Helen said, looking at the dust. "We have time," he replied, his voice full of a quiet, weary peace. She moved into the main house, but her heart remained tied to the barn. The house was theirs, a place of shared meals and quiet evenings, a place where they learned to sleep in a proper bed beside each other, their bodies slowly adjusting to the simple, profound comfort of not being alone. Helen scrubbed the floors, aired the linens, and slowly, piece by piece, claimed the space. She did not throw out Eliza's things, she simply added her own. Her charcoal drawings began to appear on the walls, next to the heavy, dark oil paintings. But every afternoon, she would walk down the hill to the barn. It was no longer her shelter. It was herself. She kept her corner, the one once walled off by canvas. She set up an easel Silas had built for her. The hayloft, the place of her surrender and his love, was her studio. She would climb the ladder and sit in the pool of light from the high window, sketching the vast, rolling plains, the sky, the distant mountains. She drew the ranch hands, their weathered faces and rough hands. She drew Stubbs, the calf, now a strong, unruly yearling. She drew Silas. She drew him when he was unaware, his back to her, mending a fence, his strength a simple, solid line. She also tended her garden. The wildflower seeds he had given her, the ones she'd clutched in her fist when she defied him, had taken root. That spring, a riot of color erupted by the barn door. Blue lupine, fiery red paintbrush, and pale, delicate columbine. It was a testament to survival, a patch of stubborn, vivid life against the harsh, brown earth. Silas understood. He never questioned her time there. He knew she was not retreating from him. She was grounding herself. The house was where they lived, but the barn was where she remembered who she was. It was her symbol of independence, the proof that she had saved herself, even as he had saved her. Their new life was built on work, and it was built on healing. One evening, Helen was reading the small, weekly paper from Cheyenne. She went still. "What is it?" Silas asked. He was at the big table, going over the ranch ledgers, a task he hated. "It's a woman in Rock Creek. Her husband was killed in the mine collapse last month. It says she has 2 small children. They're evicting her from the company housing." Helen looked up, her eyes flashing with a cold, familiar anger. "She has nowhere to go. They say the saloon is the only place offering her work." Silas saw the look on her face. He saw her, scrubbing floors, the freighters leering. He saw her, half drowned and begging at misses. Parker's door. No, Helen said, her voice a low, fierce whisper. I will not let that happen. We have the space. We have the work. The old bunkhouse. It's empty. Silas looked at her, at the fire that had replaced the fear. It's not a home, Helen. It's a bunkhouse. It's shelter, she corrected him. It's a start. We can give her a job. In the cookhouse. She can earn her keep. She can keep her dignity. And her children. He didn't hesitate. He knew what she was asking. She was asking to take their shared pain, their shared tragedies, and turn them into a purpose. Amos can have it refit by the end of the week. You ride to Rock Creek, take the good wagon, and take 2 of the men. I will, she said. When Helen returned 3 days later, she had Mrs. Beth Evans and her 2 small, terrified children in the wagon. Helen did not bring her to the main house. She brought her to the refitted bunkhouse, which was clean, warm, and stocked with food. This is yours, Helen told the woman, whose eyes were red from weeping. There is work. You will be paid a fair wage. You owe no one anything. Here, you are safe. Beth Evans was the first. She was not the last. Word spread, slowly at first, then like a river. The Millionaire Cowboy's ranch, the place of rumor and scandal, began to change its reputation. It became a sanctuary. A woman whose husband had deserted her near Fort Laramie arrived, half-starved, with a newborn. Helen gave her the job of mending. An older woman, whose son had lost their farm in a card game, came, and Helen put her in charge of the expanding chicken coop. They turned tragedy into a purpose. The ranch grew. It was no longer just a cattle operation. It was a community. The men, at first wary of the women, found their presence softened the harsh edges of their lives. The cookhouse was full of the sound of children. Mrs. Gable in town declared it a den of stray dogs and fallen women. But the town had seen Helen's victory. They had seen her strength. And they saw the good that was being done. The whispers of Boone's woman had long since died, replaced by a grudging, awed respect for Mrs. McCrae. Silas watched it all, this empire of the lost that Helen was building in his valley. She had taken his guilt and his wealth and forged them into a refuge. He had never been prouder. The summer was long and hot, and it settled into a comfortable, busy rhythm. The house was a home, the ranch was a sanctuary. One late afternoon, as the sun began to slant low, Silas came looking for her. He found her where he always did, in the barn, by her garden. The wildflowers were in full, glorious bloom, a carpet of color against the weathered gray wood. She was kneeling, her hands in the dirt, weeding. She looked up as he approached, smiling, a smudge of earth on her cheek. He did not smile back. He looked nervous, his hands thrust deep in his pockets, his shoulders tight. Silas, is something wrong? No, nothing's wrong. He stopped at the edge of the garden, at the barn door. He was standing on the exact spot where he had first set her down, a half-frozen, broken thing. He pulled his hand from his pocket. He was not holding a velvet box. He was holding a small, awkward cluster of the wildflowers she had planted, a sprig of blue lupine, a stalk of red paintbrush. I am not a man for words. Helen, he began, his voice rough, unsteady. He looked at the flowers in his hand, then at her. I know what you are. You are a woman who stands on her own. You saved yourself. I know that. He stepped forward, into the garden. This barn, it was a place of death for me, a place of fire and guilt. He touched the doorframe. Then it was your shelter. You were a lost cause, just like that calf. He looked at her, his eyes full of a raw, unguarded emotion. But you were the one who saved me. You walked into that house, and you opened the windows. You let the light in. He did not get on one knee. He was not a man for gestures. He was a man of the earth, of solid things. He stood in front of her, in the dirt, and held out the flowers. I am not asking you to be my wife because you need saving, he said, his voice thick. God knows, you are the strongest person I have ever known. I am asking because we have survived together, and I find I do not want to live the rest of my life. I do not want to watch the sun come up, unless you are standing there with me." He looked down, overwhelmed by his own words. Helen, will you marry me?" Helen's eyes filled with tears. She had fought for her name, her independence. She had built a wall of pride so high it had nearly killed her. And here he was, the one man who understood it, the one man who did not want to tear it down, but to stand beside it. She rose from her knees, wiping her dirty hands on her apron. She took the wildflowers from his trembling hand. "Yes, Silas," she whispered. "Yes, I will." They were married a week later. It was not a town affair. It was a ranch affair. They stood just outside the barn, beside the wildflower garden. Judge Potter, who now called Silas a friend, came to officiate. Amos stood as Silas's witness, his hat held over his heart. Beth Evans and the other women from the sanctuary stood with Helen, their children held quiet, their eyes full of gratitude. Helen wore a simple blue dress, one she had mended herself. Silas wore a clean shirt and his good coat, his scarred face scrubbed, his hair slicked back. The vows were short. They were not about obedience or cherishing. They were about partnership, about strength, and about holding fast. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Silas did not kiss her with the defiant passion of the courtroom. He kissed her with a quiet, profound tenderness, a promise of 1,000 sunrises. That evening, a celebration was held in the main yard. The ranch hands and the women mingled, sharing a feast from the cookhouse. Music, a lone fiddle, drifted on the warm air. As dusk settled, the sky to the west, which had been clear, began to boil. Dark clouds, the color of slate, massed on the horizon. A low, distant rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. Helen heard it. She was standing on the porch of the house, Silas beside her. She felt the familiar, cold flicker of old trauma. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of ozone and wet dust. Another crash of thunder, closer this time, rattled the windows in their frames. She flinched. She felt Silas's body tense beside her, his protective instinct kicking in. He started to put his arm around her, to pull her toward the door, toward safety. But Helen stood her ground. She looked at the approaching storm. She remembered the cabin, the flood. She remembered David, frozen. She remembered her own terror, huddled in the barn. As Silas held her, this time, she did not tremble. The wind hit, pulling at her hair, whipping her skirts. The first fat drops of rain began to fall. She turned to Silas. He was watching her, his face taut with worry. She smiled. She reached out and took his hand, the large, scarred hand that had saved her, and held it tight. "It's just wind, Silas," she said, her voice clear and calm over the rising howl. "Just water." She tugged him. "Come." She did not retreat into the house. She pulled him off the porch, out into the yard, just as the heavens opened. The rain came down, a sudden, cold deluge. It soaked them both in seconds. She tipped her face up to the sky, to the lightning that split the dark, and she was not afraid. The storm could not take anything from her, not anymore. She had faced the worst of the wind, the worst of the world, and she was still standing. Silas, watching her, his wife, standing in the rain, laughing, felt the last of his own ghosts, the smoke, the guilt, the long, lonely years wash away. He pulled her into his arms, and they stood in the heart of the storm, holding each other. She was not afraid. She was home. She knew, with an unshakable certainty, that this time love would hold. The final scene did not belong to the storm. It belonged to the morning after. The sun rose, clean and sharp, over a world that had been scoured by the rain. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and cedar. Helen and Silas stood on the porch of the house, tin cups of hot coffee in their hands. She was leaning against his side, her head resting on his shoulder. his arm wrapped securely around her waist. They stood in the comfortable silence they had built, a silence that was fuller than any words. They watched the light move across the valley, painting the high plains gold, catching the line of the distant, snow-capped mountains. Below them, at the bottom of the slope, stood the barn. It was no longer a tomb of tragic memory. It was no longer a desperate, temporary shelter. It was solid. It was permanent. The wildflower garden at its door was a splash of vivid, defiant color. It was a testament. It was the place where two broken souls had collided, where they had hidden, and where they had healed. It was not where their life was now, but it was the foundation on. Thank you for listening to our story. We truly hope you enjoyed this journey with Helen and Silas. We would love to hear your thoughts, so please share them in English in the comments below. Tell us where in the world you are listening from, and if you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories from the heart of the American frontier.